Maple Ridge Estates had once been an unassuming development, tucked away in the rolling outskirts of an American suburb. Its streets, named after local flora, Oakberry Lane, Pine Blossom Court, Willowbrook Circle, exuded a sense of manufactured quaintness. The detached houses all boasted matching roofs, carefully tended lawns, and symmetrical mailboxes, courtesy of a robust homeowners association that prided itself on uniformity. Manicured hedges lined the sidewalks, while residents kept their trash bins concealed behind neat wooden panels. It was the kind of neighborhood that, from the outside, seemed impossibly perfect. But like many such places, Maple Ridge Estates hid behind that glossy veneer a swirl of tension. Everyone nodded politely to each other at the mailbox, but gossip traveled in hushed tones. Maintaining appearances was paramount, and the HOA enforced guidelines with the vigilance of a private security force. At the center of it all, attending every meeting, reviewing every house paint request, was Victoria Driscoll, though she insisted everyone call her by a curious nickname, Karen. She was a middle-aged woman with meticulously styled hair, crisp blouse and slacks outfits, and a perpetually tight expression that hinted she was never quite satisfied. Karen wasn't the official president of the HOA. That title belonged to a genial retiree named Andrew Polk, who preferred a more laid-back approach to community management. However, Karen was the real authority, if not in name then in practice. She was the vice president, which, in her interpretation, meant she could micromanage every tree planting, every picket fence, every possible violation that threatened Maple Ridge's pristine image. Whether it was measuring grass height with a tape measure or taking photos of alleged oil stains on driveways, Karen saw it as her personal mission to keep the neighborhood up to code. Most folks in Maple Ridge either steered clear of Karen or tried to placate her with forced smiles. A few, though, ran afoul of her demands, and that was where conflicts often erupted. The watchers and the watched formed an uneasy balance, one that would soon shatter under the weight of Karen's overzealous meddling. For while Maple Ridge Estates boasted a seeming uniform perfection, the seeds of discord only needed a small push to take root in the quiet cracks of suburban life. On the corner of Willowbrook Circle stood a pale blue house that contrasted the neutral tans and grays around it. Its owner was Hannah Benton, a soft-spoken resident in her late 20s who had been living in Maple Ridge for just over a year. Hannah used a wheelchair. She had been injured in a car accident a few years back, and while she'd adjusted to life with limited mobility, she found Maple Ridge's rules occasionally stifling. However, she loved the peace the neighborhood offered: lush lawns, a ramp she could install legally by filing the proper HOA requests, and wide sidewalks where she could roll on sunny afternoons. Hannah was an avid gardener. Having grown up on a farm, she had developed a love for tending flowers and herbs. Since her accident, she'd found solace in nurturing plants, finding quiet therapy in the routine of watering them, pruning stems, and watching them grow. Each morning, she would roll onto her small front porch, where she kept rows of terracotta pots brimming with pansies, succulents, and fragrant herbs like basil and rosemary. Her care for these plants was almost maternal. She named them for fun: Rosie the rosemary, Benny the basil, and regularly chatted with them in a playful whisper. The neighbors who noticed this found it endearing, if not a little eccentric. Some would smile and wave, sometimes stopping to ask how she got her petunias to bloom so vibrantly. Hannah, in turn, was always eager to share gardening tips. She dreamt of one day expanding her plants to fill the entire porch, perhaps even setting up a greenhouse in her backyard if the HOA would allow it. Life would have likely continued peacefully for Hannah had it not been for the watchful eye of Karen. One day, as Hannah was repotting her basil into a larger container, she spotted Karen standing on the sidewalk, arms crossed. They locked eyes briefly. Something about Karen's pursed lips and raised eyebrows told Hannah she was being judged. She tried to offer a polite nod, but Karen merely spun on her heel and walked away, leaving the unsettling impression that Hannah's carefully tended porch might soon be subject to scrutiny. In the following weeks, Hannah noticed subtle signs of Karen's disapproval. She received a curt note in her mailbox from the HOA vice president, citing a regulation about excess flora obstructing the uniform appearance of porches. Technically, Hannah's pots were not blocking any walkways or property lines, but the note was enough to rattle her. She carefully measured the space between her pots and the porch edge, ensuring compliance. She wrote a reply, attaching photos that proved she wasn't violating any rules. Days later, she got a single-sentence email. "For now, it's acceptable, Karen." Such vigilance might have ended there, except Karen seemed unable to let go of any perceived imperfection. She took particular umbrage at how Hannah's bright floral displays stole attention from the muted browns and grays that characterized the rest of Maple Ridge. Some neighbors whispered that Karen disliked any sign of personal expression that deviated from her standardized vision of suburbia. Others, more cynically, believed Karen resented Hannah for garnering friendly waves from passersby, overshadowing Karen's own attempts at being the face of the community. Whatever Karen's precise motives, her antagonism soon went beyond petty notes. She began circling Hannah's home on morning walks, glancing up at the porch, scribbling in a small notebook. Once, a neighbor observed Karen snapping a photo of Hannah's newly acquired set of hanging planters. Rumors bubbled up that Karen felt the hanging planters clashed with the porch's trim color. It was all speculation, of course. No official complaint was lodged about the planters, yet a looming tension formed in the air. Hannah tried to brush it off. She had enough to worry about with her physical therapy sessions and her part-time job as a medical transcriptionist. She rationalized that as long as she followed the HOA rules, Karen's scrutiny would eventually fade. Hannah's hope, however, would prove overly optimistic. Every second Tuesday, Maple Ridge Estates held an HOA meeting in the community clubhouse, a modest, single-story building with neutral paint and an American flag fluttering out front. Attendance usually hovered around 20 residents, although the neighborhood comprised well over 100 households. Most people simply didn't want to deal with the petty dramas that arose. Hannah, for her part, rarely attended. She detested the forced smiles and the undercurrent of competition among a few top residents who vied for recognition of the best-kept yards. But as rumors of Karen's dissatisfaction circulated, Hannah decided it might be wise to show up and gauge the atmosphere. She hoped that by simply being present, she could address any concerns preemptively. That evening, the clubhouse smelled faintly of coffee and the old carpet that had been there since the early 2000s. Andrew Polk, the official president, opened the meeting with a warm, "Welcome, neighbors," and proceeded to discuss routine matters, upcoming street repairs, the budget for holiday decorations, and whether to keep or discard the battered park benches near the playground. Karen, sitting to Andrew's left, wore a professional smile that belied her eagerness to interject with her own topics. Near the end of the meeting, Karen raised her hand with a sweetly venomous expression. "I have a concern about property uniformity," she announced. "It has come to my attention that some residents have excessively large displays of potted plants on their front porches. While I appreciate horticulture, I do think we need to ensure that the neighborhood adheres to consistent aesthetic standards." Her gaze floated briefly across the room before landing on Hannah. Hannah's heart sank. She could almost feel the tension shift onto her. Another neighbor, possibly suspecting trouble, interjected. "Is there a specific property you're referring to, Karen?" Karen gave a thin smile. "I don't wish to single anyone out by name." But her eyes drifted straight to Hannah. "However, if the board would consider revisiting our guidelines on porch decorations, we might avoid future misunderstandings. It's about safeguarding property values for all." No resolution was reached that night. Andrew Polk promised they would look into it, a polite way of shelving the matter. Still, Hannah left with clammy palms, uncertain how soon Karen's vague complaint might transform into a direct assault on her beloved flowerpots. She found it hard to sleep, replaying the moment Karen's gaze pinned her like a hawk eyeing a small rodent. Little did Hannah suspect that Karen's meddling would soon become far more direct and destructive than any official meeting could capture. Summer arrived in Maple Ridge Estates. The air hummed with the buzz of cicadas, and the days stretched into warm, golden evenings. Hannah's porch bloomed in full color: red geraniums, purple petunias, bright orange marigolds. She had even added 2 large planters near the steps, each bursting with a variety of flowers. Despite Karen's shadowy hints, Hannah tried to enjoy her little sanctuary. One blistering afternoon, Hannah stepped out to water her plants. Rolling her wheelchair carefully over the threshold, she noticed something strange in one of the terracotta pots. The soil looked disturbed, as though someone had dug around. She bent closer and saw a swarm of small black ants scurrying in frantic lines, building mounds. A startled squeak escaped her. She hated to see her plants infested. Ants could sometimes be harmless, but in large numbers they could damage roots, especially if they were the biting kind. She quickly examined the adjacent pots. Every single one of them crawled with ants, far more than she'd ever seen in a single yard. It wasn't just one colony migrating naturally. It looked as though multiple colonies had taken up sudden residence. Confusion twisted in her mind. Had she done something to attract them? Maybe a sweet fertilizer? Or was it chance? Alarmed, she decided to repot a few of the worst infested plants. But when she dumped one pot's soil into a bucket to investigate, she discovered an unusual sight. A crumpled paper packet, partially disintegrated, with what looked like leftover granules inside. It resembled the packaging of store-bought insect attractant or even a container of live ants sold for certain science projects. Realization hit her like a physical blow. Someone must have deliberately introduced an ant colony, or multiple colonies, into her flower pots. That night, Hannah barely slept. She couldn't imagine why anyone would do such a thing. True, she had sensed Karen's hostility, but sabotage on this level felt deranged. Who else could it be? The following morning, she debated whether to file a police report for vandalism. She had no direct proof that Karen was responsible, only a gnawing suspicion. Still, the sense of violation was overwhelming. Ants were now ravaging her cherished garden, something she'd poured hours of love into. She tried to quell the rising panic. Perhaps a neighbor's child had been playing some prank. Maybe it was some random act. Yet, deep in her gut, a chill told her that Karen was capable of much more than nasty notes. Hannah's plight did not go unnoticed. As she struggled over the next few days to clear the infestations, some neighbors caught sight of the chaos on her porch. One evening, while Hannah was trying to salvage a half-wilting rosemary plant, an older woman named Phyllis Ramirez approached, carrying a small gardening kit. Phyllis was known around Maple Ridge for her green thumb. Her backyard boasted a lush array of exotic flowers. She'd been driving past when she spotted Hannah's distressed expression. "What happened?" Phyllis asked gently, eyeing the sea of ants. Hannah explained as best she could. Phyllis's eyebrows shot up. "That's not natural," she declared. "This many ants don't just invade from nowhere. Something or someone brought them." The two women exchanged a look of shared concern. Phyllis offered some pesticide sachets and advice on transferring the plants into fresh soil. Over the next few hours, they worked side by side, wearing gloves and masks, carefully repotting Hannah's plants into newly purchased bags of soil. Even so, the damage to some roots was already substantial. Word spread quickly among the small circle of neighbors who shared Hannah's passion for gardening. A few more arrived in the following days to lend assistance, watering new potting soil, adding ant barriers around pots, and discarding severely infested plants. A friend of Phyllis's, a retired entomologist, stopped by to identify the ants. He confirmed they were likely introduced artificially, suggesting a determined effort rather than a random fluke. The entire episode felt surreal, as if a wave of malice had flooded Maple Ridge estates under the guise of sugar-laced grains. Despite the chaos, Hannah felt a spark of hope in this unexpected unity. Perhaps she was not as alone as she feared. Phyllis and the others were a welcome buffer against the suspicion that hung in the air. For the first time since moving to Maple Ridge, Hannah began to see the neighborhood as more than just a place patrolled by an overbearing HOA. Real friendships were forming in the soil of adversity. Little did she know how crucial that unity would become as Karen's sabotage escalated. Even though Hannah's immediate crisis was partially contained, she couldn't stop wondering if Karen was truly responsible. She felt trapped. If she accused Karen publicly without proof, the HOA might label her paranoid. But if she did nothing, Karen could strike again. Torn, she confided in Phyllis and a couple of other close neighbors. They advised caution and suggested maybe setting up a discreet camera. Hannah considered it, but was reluctant to turn her home into a surveillance zone. She still clung to the hope that Maple Ridge, for all its quirks, was not a place where neighbors needed to spy on each other. Still, an answer came sooner than expected. 2 weeks after the ant incident, Hannah received a phone call from one of Karen's acquaintances, Monica Green, a longtime Maple Ridge resident who'd always been cordial if distant. Monica sounded uneasy. I I need to tell you something, she began haltingly. This is hard, but you deserve to know. Monica explained that she had overheard Karen boasting about putting pests into a porch garden. According to Monica, Karen had been sipping coffee at a local cafe with a mutual friend and arrogantly described how she'd purchased live ants and seeds to sabotage ugly horticultural displays. Karen had apparently laughed, calling them pathetic plants that didn't fit Maple Ridge's image. Monica, appalled, had demanded to know who Karen was talking about. Karen had demurred, but Monica put two and two together when she heard about the fiasco at Hannah's house. I wish I had confronted her more aggressively, Monica said, her voice trembling with guilt. But at that moment, I was just shocked. I'm so sorry. I don't know why she's targeting you. Maybe it's your bright pots. Or something else. Monica left the conversation with an offer to testify if it ever came to a formal hearing. She also expressed fear of Karen's retaliation if she spoke too openly. She can make life miserable, Monica whispered. But the truth matters. Hannah felt a cocktail of emotions. Anger, vindication, disgust. Now she had something resembling proof, even if it was secondhand. But the question lingered. How best to use it? Turning to the police might lead nowhere unless she had direct evidence. Reporting to the HOA board could stir up more drama, especially if Karen denied it. Still, Hannah was done feeling powerless. She resolved that if Karen tried anything else, she would not remain silent. Emboldened by her success with the ants, Karen didn't stop. Perhaps she believed the small victory would force Hannah to remove her pots for good. But in the weeks that followed, as Hannah diligently revived her plants, Karen's frustration clearly mounted. Neighbors saw her glaring whenever she passed by Hannah's porch. Rumor had it she'd even requested an official inspection from the HOA on the premise that Hannah's porch might be hosting pests that could spread to other homes. Then, one sweltering afternoon, Hannah returned from a medical appointment to find 3 of her newly potted flowers appended on the porch floor. The pots lay broken, soil spilling down the steps, petals torn as though trampled. Nearby was a small trail of sugar ants, as if they had been shaken from another container. This time, there was no question of an accident or random animals. It looked deliberate, a direct assault on Hannah's horticultural refuge. Trembling with anger, Hannah snapped photos of the damage. She found footprints smudged in the soil. Someone had stomped on the pot shards. The doorbell camera of a neighbor across the street captured a figure crossing Hannah's porch about an hour earlier, but the face was obscured by a baseball cap. Still, the posture and silhouette strongly suggested Karen. Hannah sat in her wheelchair, tears burning her eyes as she called Phyllis, who rushed over with a couple of other gardening friends. This has gone beyond petty, Phyllis declared, voice tight with anger. It's a crime. They helped Hannah collect the broken pottery, salvage what plants they could, and calm her nerves. The repeated attacks left Hannah feeling unsafe, singled out. Some of the group murmured that they should confront Karen directly, but others cautioned that without an absolutely clear video or eyewitness, she might squirm free of blame. In the days that followed, a hush fell over Maple Ridge. People talked in subdued tones about the flowerpot vandal. Karen continued to patrol the neighborhood, a faint smirk on her face whenever she saw Hannah. There was no official apology, no claim of innocence, just the uneasy sense that Karen enjoyed holding the power to instill fear. But the community wasn't about to stand idly by. Outrage simmered among local gardeners. Phyllis and a few others decided enough was enough. They called a casual meeting at Phyllis's home, inviting Hannah and about 10 other residents who had a stake in gardening or simply despised Karen's bullying tactics. Over coffee and homemade muffins, they brainstormed ways to protect Hannah's plants and perhaps turn the situation around. A landscaping enthusiast named Derek Matthews suggested building a greenhouse structure in Hannah's backyard, something that would be more secure and less accessible to random prowlers. If the HOA allows it, he noted, we could put in pest-resistant planters. They're made of a special material that's not inviting for insects and can deter them from nesting. Another neighbor, an avid inventor, mentioned self-watering planters with built-in ant barriers. Hannah's eyes sparkled with cautious excitement. Constructing a greenhouse had always been her dream, but she worried about cost and the inevitable hoops of HOA approval. The group responded with unwavering support. We'll fundraise, Phyllis declared. We'll host a community rummage sale, or we'll set up a small crowdfund. Everyone loves your plants, Hannah. People will pitch in. A hush fell in the room. This was bigger than a simple show of sympathy. It was the neighborhood's answer to Karen's spite. If Karen wanted to destroy Hannah's garden, Maple Ridge would help it flourish, bigger and better than before. One neighbor commented, "I don't care if Karen tries to block the permit. We'll argue that a greenhouse raises property values by showcasing horticultural excellence." They chuckled at the idea of beating Karen at her own argument about property values. Before adjourning, they agreed on a plan. Apply for HOA permission to construct a modest greenhouse corner in Hannah's backyard, using specialized planters that resist infestations. Additionally, they'd recommend installing a few discreet security cameras to catch any future mischief. The alliance left with a renewed sense of purpose. Karen had unwittingly galvanized them into a formidable community force. Unsurprisingly, getting HOA approval for a greenhouse wasn't straightforward. A few days after the alliance meeting, Hannah submitted the official request, complete with design sketches and an explanation of why she needed an enclosed garden space. The blueprint showed a small greenhouse, about 8 feet by 6, using transparent polycarbonate panels. It was hardly a colossal structure. Still, within a week, she received a letter from the HOA stating the board had concerns about the aesthetic impact and needed more information. Karen, of course, leveraged her position as vice president to slow down the process. She insisted on multiple reviews of the architectural plan. She claimed the greenhouse might reflect sunlight into neighbors' windows, or that it could reduce the uniform appearance of the yards. Andrew Polk, the HOA president, tried to remain neutral but seemed heavily influenced by Karen's arguments. At one point, the board demanded a list of all possible plant species Hannah intended to grow, as if that was relevant to the greenhouse's structure. Hannah's supporters weren't discouraged. They gathered at her house, helping her craft polite, meticulously detailed responses. Derek used his drafting skills to produce professional-grade sketches. Another neighbor, a civil engineer, drew up a quick drainage plan to show that the greenhouse wouldn't cause water runoff issues. Piece by piece, they dismantled every objection the board raised. During one tense HOA meeting, Karen grilled Hannah with borderline insulting questions. "Do you have the physical capacity to maintain a greenhouse? We wouldn't want a half-finished project becoming an eyesore." The arrogance of questioning Hannah's abilities sent a wave of outrage through the audience. Phyllis stood up, voice trembling with anger. "What on earth does that have to do with granting the permit? Hannah's more than capable, and she has plenty of volunteers to help." Karen's tight smile never wavered, but her eyes flashed with displeasure at being challenged so openly. A final hearing was scheduled for the permit. By then, half the neighborhood seemed invested in the outcome. Hannah felt anxious. If the board voted no, she feared Karen would interpret it as a green light to continue harassing her plants. But if they voted yes, the greenhouse would become a symbol of defiance against Karen's tyranny. The night of the hearing, the community clubhouse buzzed with an unusually large crowd. Even residents who didn't garden showed up, curious to see if Karen could be thwarted. Andrew Polk called the meeting to order, the tension palpable. Karen, wearing a crisp suit, sat with perfect posture and an air of self-assurance. Hannah, supported by Phyllis and Derek, waited quietly. The greenhouse proposal was the sole topic. One by one, supporters stood up to speak, explaining how an enclosed structure would actually enhance Maple Ridge's image, well-maintained, visually appealing, and safe from pests. Phyllis reminded the board of the repeated vandalism, carefully skirting around naming Karen directly, yet emphasizing the need for a secure space for a neighbor with special needs. Derek flashed professional drawings, even showing pictures of greenhouses in comparable suburban neighborhoods that had integrated seamlessly. Karen responded with a litany of objections. She claimed that a greenhouse might set a precedent, unleashing a wave of unregulated structures. She worried about glare, possible noise from greenhouse fans, and the risk of exotic pests. The more she spoke, the more contrived her objections sounded. Audience members rolled their eyes, some stifling laughter. Eventually, the board went into private deliberations. After half an hour, a nerve-wracking wait, they emerged. Andrew Polk read a brief statement. "The board has decided, by a vote of 4-1, to approve the greenhouse request with the recommended guidelines for size and materials." We expect it will be a positive addition to the neighborhood." A small eruption of cheers reverberated in the clubhouse. Karen's face hardened, but she clapped politely with minimal enthusiasm. Clearly, she was the lone dissenting vote. To Hannah, it felt like a triumph not just for her garden, but for her sense of belonging. She'd gone toe-to-toe with Karen's intimidation and emerged with official backing. Now came the real work: building the greenhouse, installing pest-resistant pots, and ensuring that no further sabotage could ruin her renewed dreams. Over the next few weeks, the plan came to life. Derek coordinated materials: aluminum frames, polycarbonate panels, specialized planters. The rummage sale was a success, raising funds to offset much of the cost. Neighbors donated time and labor, some even pitching in extra cash. Hannah watched from her wheelchair in awe as volunteers assembled the framework in her backyard. She helped where she could, holding screws, passing tools, and offering refreshments. The sense of community was palpable. People who'd never spoken much before found themselves working side by side, forging new friendships over shared tasks. Children wandered in to watch the construction, while older residents offered tips based on their own handyman experiences. A local hardware store pitched in with a discount on materials after hearing the story of how vandalism had spurred the project. Throughout it all, Karen lurked at the edges of the scene. She never approached directly, just took photos or observed from a distance. Sometimes, she'd send petty email complaints to the HOA about excessive noise or potential property line infringements. Each time, Andrew Polk would come by, measure the boundary to confirm compliance, and leave with a shrug, having found nothing amiss. With each unsubstantiated complaint, Karen's credibility eroded further. When the structure was finally complete, Hannah wheeled inside for the first time with tears of gratitude in her eyes. The greenhouse smelled of fresh soil and warm air. Shelving units lined the sides, waiting for potted herbs, vegetables, and flowers. The specialized pest-resistant planters were there, gleaming with a sense of quiet defiance. A neighbor had even installed a discreet camera in the corner, aimed at the door, just in case someone tried to intrude without permission. Transplanting Hannah's cherished plants into the greenhouse felt almost ceremonial. She and Phyllis gently lifted each pot, placing it in its new home. Over the following days, they added fresh seeds, a few new perennials, and carefully monitored the water levels in the self-watering planters. The design was clever. Small reservoirs at the bottom of each pot allowed water to wick up into the soil, minimizing the risk of overwatering and discouraging ants from seeking moisture. The difference was immediate. Without constant exposure to the open porch, the plants thrived with stable warmth and reduced pests. Hannah's succulent collection, battered by the earlier ant invasion, now revived in the greenhouse's controlled environment. She jokingly called it her mini Eden, a pocket of serene greenery amid the broader tension of Maple Ridge. Neighbors visited with fascination, marveling at the greenhouse's efficient design. Some considered building their own. Far from becoming an eyesore, the greenhouse garnered praise. Even Andrew Polk complimented Hannah on the aesthetic appeal, remarking that it reflected well on the community. This shift in sentiment only deepened Karen's frustration. She watched as the greenhouse, which she had tried so hard to prevent, became a neighborhood success story. The more recognition Hannah received, the more Karen's resentment seemed to fester. Despite the greenhouse's success, Hannah remained wary. She remembered how determined Karen had been to sabotage her porch garden. Now that Hannah's horticulture was flourishing more than ever, who was to say Karen wouldn't escalate? So she took the advice of several neighbors and upgraded her security measures. A discreet camera at the greenhouse entrance captured motion-activated footage. Another small camera, shaped like a birdhouse, overlooked Hannah's backyard. The feed connected to Hannah's phone and computer, allowing her to check if anyone lurked around at odd hours. It was unfortunate to resort to such vigilance in her own home, but the memory of upended pots and sugar-laced soil haunted her. Phyllis also gave Hannah a small gift, a potted marigold in a distinctive clay container. She explained that marigolds were natural pest repellents, and the bright yellow bloom symbolized resilience and optimism. Hannah placed it at the greenhouse threshold like a guardian sentinel. Some nights, before rolling inside, she'd pause to look at the marigold's vivid petals, drawing courage from the tiny flower's determined stance. Word spread among the neighbors about the new cameras. Some felt sad it had come to this. Others expressed relief that Hannah had a deterrent against any future vandalism. Karen, of course, took note. More than one resident spotted her glancing suspiciously at the greenhouse, as if calculating how to circumvent those watchful electronic eyes. The stage was set for a potential showdown, one that would soon materialize in a dramatic twist. It happened late one night. Hannah had dozed off in front of the TV, only to be jolted awake by her phone buzzing, an alert from the greenhouse camera. Heart pounding, she quickly opened the surveillance app. The screen showed a dark figure stepping into the greenhouse doorway, fiddling with something near the planters. Hannah's mind raced. The silhouette wore a hooded jacket, the face partially concealed. The angle wasn't perfect, but the figure's build and posture looked disturbingly familiar. She tapped furiously at her phone screen, switching to record mode. Through the greenhouse's dim interior light, she glimpsed an arm extending over one of the planters. The figure seemed to be dumping something into the soil. Gritting her teeth, Hannah called Phyllis and Derek. Within minutes, Derek and a couple of neighbors raced over. Hannah stayed indoors, watching the camera feed, fear twisting her gut. She saw the intruder's head snap up, as if hearing footsteps. The figure bolted, slipping out the side door and disappearing into the darkness. When Derek arrived, he found the greenhouse door slightly ajar, traces of powdery granules on the edge of a pot. He snapped photos with his phone, carefully scooping some of the substance into a Ziploc bag. As Hannah and the others joined him, arms trembling from adrenaline, they noted a faint chemical odor. It was reminiscent of the insect attractant or sugar-based feed used in ant traps. Shaken, Hannah scrolled back through the footage to get a clearer look. Though the figure had worn a hood, a brief side profile was caught by the camera. The nose, the chin shape, everyone present felt it strongly resembled Karen. The very idea that she would risk sneaking into a greenhouse in the dead of night, just to sabotage plants, seemed almost unbelievable. And yet, the evidence spoke for itself. They debated calling the police right then and there. Ultimately, they decided to file a formal report in the morning with both the HOA and local law enforcement. Enough was enough. The following day, Hannah and Derek brought the camera footage to an impromptu HOA session with Andrew Polk. Visibly rattled, Andrew examined the footage. Though not crystal clear, the figure's height and body shape strongly suggested Karen. The partial glimpses of the face added to the suspicion. Derek presented the bag of powder, though none of them were quite sure what it was yet. Andrew rubbed his temples. "This is unprecedented," he muttered. "If that is indeed Karen, she's violating multiple laws. Trespassing, property damage, maybe more. Not to mention she's a sitting HOA officer." Hannah stayed silent, fighting the swirl of hurt and anger. Andrew promised to summon Karen for an urgent discussion, though he also cautioned that the HOA wasn't a law enforcement body. Sure enough, Karen appeared later that afternoon with an air of icy composure. When Andrew confronted her with the footage, she denied everything. She claimed she'd been home all night, that the figure in the video could be anyone. She demanded to see the so-called evidence, but scoffed at the grainy silhouette, dismissing it as inconclusive. "We all know Hannah's had a chip on her shoulder about me," Karen hissed. "This is a smear tactic because I opposed her greenhouse." The conversation spiraled into a tense standoff. Hannah, for her part, refused to be cowed. She calmly described the repeated attacks, the packet she'd found before, the neighbor's testimony who heard Karen brag about dumping ants. Karen shot back with accusations of libel and threatened a defamation lawsuit if they continued to slander her name without proof. Andrew, caught in the middle, scheduled an official hearing for the next HOA meeting, urging both parties to present their arguments. He added that the police might need to get involved if the evidence supported a criminal act. Leaving the clubhouse, Hannah felt both relieved that the matter was finally out in the open and terrified of what Karen might do next. The saboteur had escalated to a nocturnal break-in, a bold and dangerous move. But with the camera footage in hand and the community rallying behind her, Hannah felt more determined than ever to stand her ground. That evening, Hannah filed a police report for trespassing and attempted vandalism, handing over a copy of the camera footage. The officer on duty, a courteous middle-aged man named Officer Chu, listened with concern. He took detailed notes about the prior incidents and how they connected to the recent break-in. Though he warned that identifying the figure with absolute certainty might be challenging, he promised they would investigate, possibly test the powdery substance. Hannah's biggest worry was retaliation. What if Karen decided to do something even more brazen? She confided this fear to Officer Chu, who advised her to keep her cameras rolling and remain vigilant. He also mentioned that if the evidence was strong enough, the prosecutor could consider criminal charges. The thought of Karen facing legal consequences felt surreal, but after the repeated destruction, it also felt warranted. As Hannah went about her day, neighbors dropped by to show support. One brought homemade cookies, another offered to sit with Hannah during the next HOA hearing. Word had spread quickly, and many were outraged that Karen might stoop to literal sabotage under cover of darkness. At the same time, Maple Ridge possessed a certain quiet tension. Some feared crossing Karen, knowing her vindictiveness. But a clear majority now seemed on Hannah's side. After all, vandalizing a greenhouse, especially for a disabled neighbor, was crossing more lines than even the strictest HOA supporter could rationalize. 2 weeks later, the HOA convened an emergency meeting in the clubhouse. The atmosphere crackled with anticipation. Residents packed the small room, leaning against walls, straining to hear. Andrew Polk sat at the front, flanked by 2 other board members. Karen took a seat on one side, arms folded, chin tilted upward. Hannah rolled to a spot near the front, surrounded by her supporters. Andrew cleared his throat and launched into a review of the situation. He summarized Hannah's complaint of ongoing vandalism, culminating in the greenhouse incident captured on video. Karen's defense was read into the record. She'd submitted a statement insisting she was innocent, claiming the footage was too blurry to be reliable, and that Hannah had orchestrated a witch hunt. Once testimony began, Hannah recounted the timeline of attacks: the ants, the torn pots, the repeated sabotage. Phyllis described discovering the suspicious insect infestations, while Derek spoke about the substance they found in the greenhouse. Monica Green, visibly nervous, took the floor to share what she had overheard Karen bragging about in the cafe. That testimony drew a shocked murmur from the crowd. Karen's face reddened, though she tried to maintain a smug expression. When Karen finally spoke, she hurled accusations of lying, paranoia, and defamation. She claimed Monica was a disgruntled ex-friend looking for attention. She sneered at Hannah for supposedly playing the victim card. But each denial felt hollow in the face of the collective evidence. Andrew pressed her for an alibi on the night the cameras captured the intrusion. Karen hemmed and hawed, providing no clear details except that she was at home watching television. No one had seen her that night. She had no receipts or phone records to corroborate her story. Despite not being a court of law, the HOA board had authority to censure members for misconduct and to recommend further legal action. Andrew exchanged glances with the other board members, then announced that the matter was serious enough to warrant an official HOA sanction against Karen. Furthermore, he suggested that the footage and eyewitness testimony were strong grounds for the local police investigation. The room erupted in hushed applause. Karen's face twisted in rage. She marched out before the meeting adjourned, ignoring those who tried to speak to her. In the days following the meeting, the HOA issued a formal letter censuring Karen for actions unbecoming of an officer and potentially criminal behavior. She was stripped of her vice president duties pending the police's final determination. Some longtime neighbors who had once towed Karen's line began distancing themselves, fearful of being tarnished by association. The once intimidating figure now looked isolated and defensive. Karen, however, was not one to vanish quietly. She posted angry tirades on the community forum, accusing the HOA of a kangaroo court and claiming Hannah had staged everything. Few believed her. The forum lit up with residents calling for her to either apologize or move out. A handful of her allies tried to defend her, but the tide of public opinion had shifted irrevocably. The sabotage of a disabled neighbor's greenhouse was simply beyond excuse. Meanwhile, Hannah felt a strange mixture of relief and heartbreak. She had never intended for Maple Ridge to become a battleground. She just wanted to garden in peace. Still, she couldn't deny a warm surge of gratitude each time a neighbor offered support or praised her resilience. The greenhouse thrived, the plants growing vibrantly despite the tension swirling around them. Somehow, Karen's destructive antics had only cemented Hannah's place in the neighborhood as a symbol of perseverance. Officer Chu stopped by with a final update. The substance from the greenhouse was indeed a sugar-based attractant laced with pesticide, similar to the kind sold in pest control stores. He said the investigation might lead to charges if the DA found the evidence sufficient. Karen had declined any further interviews with the police, but had hired a lawyer. For the moment, the police encouraged Hannah to remain patient while the legal wheels turned. Summer transitioned into a breezy fall, the maple trees around the neighborhood turning vivid shades of red and gold. Hannah's greenhouse took on a different beauty in cooler weather, the translucent panels fogging slightly in the crisp mornings. Inside, her plants continued to flourish, herbs, flowers, even a few experimental vegetables. The local gardening club invited her to showcase her greenhouse in a small magazine spread on accessible horticulture. She agreed, hoping her story might inspire others facing adversity. The HOA, eager to salvage its reputation after the fiasco, organized a community horticulture day, highlighting local gardens and awarding small prizes for creativity and sustainability. The event drew families and gardening enthusiasts from all over Maple Ridge. Children ran from yard to yard, collecting stickers on their garden passports. Neighbors exchanged gardening tips, snacked on refreshments, and bonded over the shared love of plant life. The highlight, of course, was Hannah's greenhouse. A steady stream of visitors marveled at the setup: pest-resistant planters, self-watering systems, carefully labeled rows of plants. Andrew Polk personally handed Hannah a plaque from the HOA, commending her for her resilience and positive contribution to neighborhood aesthetics. The wording was a veiled reference to the trials she had endured. Hannah accepted it with a humble smile, acknowledging the role everyone played in supporting her. Karen was nowhere to be seen. Rumor had it she was still sulking at home, refusing to open her door to any visitors. Some believed she might put her house on the market soon, unable to bear living in a neighborhood where she had lost face. Others speculated she'd dig in her heels, continuing to fight the charges from behind closed curtains. Whatever her fate, Maple Ridge had moved on, forging a new unity in the wake of her sabotage. That evening, after the Horticulture Day festivities wound down, Hannah lingered in her greenhouse alone. She gently ran her fingers over the petals of a blooming geranium, remembering the heartbreak of the ant infestation and the shattered pots. A soft smile touched her lips. Karen's cruelty had, ironically, led to this: a stronger, thriving garden, protected by supportive neighbors who had embraced Hannah as one of their own. For all of Karen's malicious acts, she had only succeeded in unifying the community around Hannah and her beloved plants. In the weeks that followed, Maple Ridge Estates basked in an atmosphere of renewed camaraderie. The sudden wave of neighborly spirit extended beyond Hannah's greenhouse. Households organized potluck dinners. Kids played hopscotch on sidewalks without fear of petty citations, and the overall tone of the HOA meetings turned more constructive. While issues still arose, parking violations, fence disputes, there was a new sense of compassion. As for Hannah, she embraced her role as an informal gardening mentor. She conducted small workshops in her greenhouse, teaching residents about pest prevention, seed germination, and adaptive gardening techniques for those with physical limitations. The greenhouse cameras still quietly recorded every night, a sobering reminder of past troubles, but no further incidents occurred. It was as though Karen's sabotage had forced the neighborhood to confront how damaging unchecked arrogance could be. One chilly afternoon, Hannah carefully turned the pages of the local gardening magazine that had featured her. The article praised her greenhouse as a shining example of resilience, noting how a malicious attack spurred the creation of a safe, welcoming horticultural haven. The piece ended with a quote from Hannah: "Plants, like people, can flourish in unexpected places when nurtured with kindness." Reading those words, Hannah felt tears prick the corners of her eyes. She realized that, in some odd way, she was grateful for the adversity. It had revealed the strength of community and the kindness hidden behind the neutral facades of Maple Ridge's homes. Karen's house, ironically, still stood in pristine condition. Neighbors rarely spotted her, though a few claimed to see a curtain move occasionally, as if she watched the street with the same controlling gaze. Whether she stayed or eventually moved away, her influence had undoubtedly waned. Where once her intimidation shaped the community's mood, Now the memory of her sabotage only reaffirmed the neighborhood's unity. Standing in her greenhouse at dusk, the soft glow of the overhead lights illuminating rows of thriving plants, Hannah inhaled the sweet scent of blooming geraniums. A gentle breeze rustled the polycarbonate panels. She thought back to the day she first discovered the ants swarming her flower pots, the heartbreak of cradling ruined plants in her hands. Now, she gazed upon a resilient tapestry of green and color, evidence that life could push through any layer of darkness, given the right support. And for every malicious attempt at destruction, there would always be a stronger wave of hope ready to blossom.